So it was my first year of rabbinical school, and I heard about this professor that everybody said you had to meet. He was an older man and comprehensively learned, and he spoke a lot of languages, and I had been reading a book that used the German phrase noch einmal. Now, I took a year of German in college, but it was a disaster. By the end of the semester, in the final, the only thing I could write on every line was Ich bin ein Berliner. And I became convinced that Mark Twain was right, that the German language was an excuse for spitting at people. So I thought, here's my entree. I can go up to him and ask him what this phrase means. So I saw him in the hall, and I said, Professor Slomovic, my name's David Wolpe. I'm a new rabbinical student. Can you tell me, please, what does noch einmal mean? And he said, once again. And I said, what does noch einmal mean? And he said, once again. And I thought, the man is old, probably a little hard of hearing. So I went, what does noch einmal mean? And he looked at me with that look of pity that you have for those who will never succeed in life. And he said, noch einmal means once again. That's a story of disconnection. And a lot of our stories, especially humorous stories, are stories of missed connections and disconnection. A literary critic about 100 years ago said there were only two kinds of stories. Every story you know, he said, is either a person goes on a journey or a stranger comes to town. And everything fits into one of those categories. But I want to give you a different taxonomy, a different way of categorizing stories, because every story needs a certain kind of structure. All of creativity needs it. Creativity without discipline is like a blender with the top off. It doesn't help you create your story. So the first is a story of disconnection. Now I want to tell you a story of connection. It's a biblical one. Jacob and Esau. You may recall, and if not, I'll remind you, that in the Bible, Jacob steals the birthright from his older brother, who says, I'm going to kill you as soon as our father dies. Decades pass. Jacob has run away from home, he's lived his own life, and he hears, after 20 years, that his brother Esau is coming with 400 men. And he's terrified, and all sorts of things happen in the meantime. But then, when they meet up, what happens is Esau looks at him and falls on his neck and weeps. And the question is, what changed this man from vengeful and angry and murderous to weeping? Now, Esau and Jacob were twins. And many years ago, my father told me that he thought what happened is based, in fact, in part, on a difference between the ancient world and our world. In the ancient world, you didn't see yourself. You didn't have mirrors everywhere. In fact, almost nowhere. And if you saw yourself in a pond, well, that's a very sort of inchoate, ripply, unclear way of seeing your own face, which means that unlike today when we're very familiar, too familiar, constantly familiar, agonizingly familiar, dispiritingly familiar with what we look like, back then, you didn't see yourself, and you didn't know, and you didn't think about it. Now, he said, after decades, Esau sees Jacob. And even though they weren't identical twins, it was the first time that he saw himself and how old he had become, and how many years he had wasted in hating. And seeing this reflection of himself, he could only weep. That's a story of connection. And those two different kinds of stories are most of the poles of the stories we tell. But ultimately, even stories of connection are not where we want to end up. We want to end up in a different kind of story. So let me tell you one more. This is also a story of my father. When he was a child, when he was about 11 years old, his father died. And the tradition is that you would go every day to the synagogue and say a prayer in memory of a parent who died. So he started to walk to the synagogue every day, and one day he saw the ritual director, whose name was actually Mr. Einstein, no relation to the famous one. And Mr. Einstein said to him, "You know, I walk by your house every day. I may as well have somebody to walk with so I don't have to go alone." So my father said, as an 11-year-old boy, Mr. Einstein walked with him through the Boston summer and winter and fall, and acted as a sort of surrogate father and ushered him back into life. Many years later, when my oldest brother was born, he wanted to take his oldest child and introduce him to Mr. Einstein. So he and my mother took the baby and called Mr. Einstein in Boston when they were visiting, and he said, "Look, I'm old now, I don't drive anymore, but you can come visit me." And he drove to his house, and he said he began to cry because it was miles from where my father lived. And every morning, Mr. Einstein had walked miles in order to pick my father up, to hold his hand, and walk him to the synagogue and make him whole again. Now that's something deeper than a story of connection. That's a story of redemption. And ultimately, those are the stories that we want to live and we want to tell. Those are the stories that change our souls and change the world. And so, let me close with a family story of connection, disconnection, and redemption all at once. I gave my father lots of time, so let me give my mother equal time. My mother, several decades ago, had a debilitating stroke, and she's aphasic. She can't speak, or if she speaks, she can speak one word, sometimes two or three, rarely more than that. And she's been struggling with this for many decades. And several years ago, my brothers and I went back to Philadelphia after my father had died to take my mother out for her 80th birthday dinner. And we took her out to dinner, and we had this lovely dinner, and at the end of the dinner, my brothers and I all took out our wallets to pay, and she looked at us and she went, "No!" And we were shocked. This is my mother, after all. But we didn't want to argue with her, so we said, "Okay," and we put our wallets away, and then she looked at us again, understanding we clearly didn't comprehend her meaning, and she said, "Dessert!" And in that single word was all of it. All of it. The pain of the disconnection, the connection, and a little glimpse of redemption. Those are the stories we live and the stories we tell. The ones of pain and sometimes of humor that pull us apart, the disconnection. The ones of warmth and often of love that are of connection. And the ones of self-transcendence, where we go beyond who we are and who we think we can be to bring ourselves together in a new way, a different way, to change our souls, to change each other, and to change the world. Thank you.